The sun hung low over St. Mary's, casting a warm golden light that made the village seem even more picturesque than usual. It was a scene straight out of a postcard, with its winding cobblestone streets, quaint thatched cottages, and the soft hum of the village in full bloom. The air was fresh with the scent of flowers, and the birds serenaded the guests gathered at Mrs. Bertram's annual garden party. Mrs. Bertram, a sharp-eyed widow in her mid-60s, was one of the few remaining pillars of the local aristocracy. She had lived in St. Mary's for longer than anyone could remember, and over the years had become something of a figurehead in the village. The garden party she hosted each year was always a grand affair, bringing together not only the village's upper crust but also the working folk, shopkeepers, farmers, and teachers, creating a curious mix of class and personalities. The garden itself was the pride of Mrs. Bertram's life. A series of well-kept flower beds stretched out before the house, with rows of roses in full bloom, their fragrance drifting lazily through the air. The meticulously pruned hedges shaped the landscape, like living walls, and the stone path, lined with lavender, led up to the large wooden doors of Mrs. Bertram's home. The tables set with delicate china were surrounded by the chatter of the villagers, as they nibbled on cucumber sandwiches and sipped tea from fine porcelain cups. A string quartet played softly from the corner of the garden, its delicate notes drifting over the crowd like a pleasant breeze. Nearby, a group of children ran gleefully in and out of the maze of hedges, their laughter punctuating the otherwise serene atmosphere. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly in the shade of an old oak tree at the far end of the garden, her ever-watchful eyes scanning the crowd. She was dressed modestly in a simple lavender dress with a matching hat, but beneath the unassuming exterior lay a mind as sharp as a tack, always observing, always cataloging. At 75, Miss Marple had seen enough of life's intricacies to understand the subtleties of human behavior and the small, often overlooked details that revealed the truth. She was the village's quiet observer, the one who saw things others missed. She watched as the guests mingled, exchanging pleasantries and idle gossip. Her eyes were drawn to the group of young wives who sat together, giggling behind their fans and whispering about the latest scandal involving one of the local farmers. Across the lawn, she noticed the elderly men deep in conversation about the cricket match that had taken place the previous week, their voices a mixture of pride and gentle rivalry. Nearby, Dr. Gerald Parsons, the local physician, was talking to Miss Parsons, the schoolteacher. Miss Marple had already made a note of the doctor's slightly nervous demeanor whenever his wife wasn't around. Miss Parsons, the teacher, was a woman of refined manners, but with an air of quiet tension about her. There were subtle dynamics at play between the doctor and his wife, and Miss Marple wondered if the schoolteacher wasn't the only one with secrets to hide. Her attention shifted to a figure standing alone near the garden wall. It was Douglas Phillimore, the new solicitor in town. Miss Marple had only recently become acquainted with him, and despite his polished exterior and carefully crafted words, she had already pegged him as someone who kept his emotions and thoughts under tight control. He wasn't a man who easily fit into the village's easy rhythms. Miss Marple had watched him before, noticing how he always stood apart from the crowd, observing without truly participating. His icy blue eyes were fixed on the proceedings, though he showed no interest. In the merriment around him, it was as though he was a stranger, observing a world that didn't belong to him. "Isn't it a lovely day?" came a voice beside her, breaking her thoughts. Miss Marple turned to see Mrs. Clara Wren, the vicar's wife, standing next to her. Clara was a cheerful woman, always eager for conversation and fond of gossip. Her round face was flushed with the warmth of the sun, and her wide-brimmed hat shaded her eyes. "Quite lovely," Miss Marple replied, her tone soft. "Though, I wonder, Clara, if all is as peaceful as it appears?" Mrs. Wren looked at her with raised eyebrows. "What do you mean? It's the perfect afternoon." Miss Marple gave a small smile. "There are always things lurking just beneath the surface, my dear. People don't always show what they truly feel." Clara laughed, shaking her head. "You do have a way of making everything sound so mysterious, Jane." Miss Marple didn't respond directly, her gaze once again drifting over the crowd. She had learned long ago that in a village like St. Mary's, nothing was ever as simple as it seemed. Everyone had a past, and every past had secrets, some more dangerous than others. The peace of the afternoon was suddenly shattered by a loud cry from across the garden. Mrs. Bertram stood frozen by the large wooden door of her house, her hand raised to her mouth in a gesture of disbelief. The guests around her froze in confusion, turning their heads to follow her gaze. There, lying, motionless on the stone path, was the body of Miss Parsons, the schoolteacher. Her pale face was turned to one side, eyes wide open in shock. Blood pooled around her head, staining the stone beneath her. The sight was jarring, unnatural, an interruption to the idyllic scene that had only moments before seemed so tranquil. The guests immediately erupted into chaos. Some screamed, others rushed forward to help, while a few simply stood frozen, unable to process what they were seeing. Mrs. Bertram's voice rang out, frantic with fear. "Someone please help her!" she screamed, her voice trembling. Miss Marple remained seated, unmoving. Her gaze flickered briefly to the scene before her, taking in the frantic movements of the villagers, but her mind, as always, was already working. She studied the reactions of the crowd, noticing the subtle differences in their behavior. Mrs. Bertram, of course, was beside herself as expected. The vicar's wife, Clara Wren, was visibly distressed, clutching her chest as though she might faint at any moment. Dr. Parsons was quick to rush to the body, his medical training kicking in, though his face betrayed the same stunned disbelief that everyone else was feeling. And there was Douglas Phillimore, standing stiffly by the wall, his expression unreadable, yet his stance, slightly too still, caught Miss Marple's attention. As the village constable arrived, along with several others from the local police, the garden party had turned into an impromptu crime scene. The guests were ushered into groups, their stories taken down, their movements tracked, but Miss Marple did not immediately join the fray. Instead, she remained seated on her bench, watching, listening. She knew the first steps of the investigation would be filled with noise and confusion, but soon enough, the cracks in the surface would begin to show. After all, in Miss Marple's experience, the truth had a way of revealing itself in the most unexpected places. And the truth behind this murder, she was certain, lay not in the blood spilled on the stones, but in the people who surrounded her. The afternoon wore on, but Miss Marple's mind remained sharp. The reactions, the body language, there was something important to be gleaned from these first moments. She could already tell that this was no simple murder. The locked door to Mrs. Bertram's study, where Miss Parsons had often been seen, held a clue. A small detail that no one else would notice, but one that would make all the difference in the end. "Clara," Miss Marple said softly, almost as if speaking to herself, "I do believe we have just witnessed the beginning of something much larger than we could ever imagine." The vicar's wife, still in shock, nodded vaguely, her mind too clouded to grasp the full implications of Miss Marple's words. But Miss Marple was already planning her next steps, careful, deliberate, and just a touch sly. She had seen enough to know that the truth would soon reveal itself, and when it did, it would be a revelation none of them would expect. The following hours after Miss Parsons's death were a blur of activity, confusion, and growing tension. The small village of St. Mary's, so accustomed to its quiet, untroubled days, had been thrust into an unsettling new reality. As the constable, a somewhat flustered man named Officer Crawley, took charge of the scene, the guests were herded inside the house, away from the prying eyes of the public, where they would be questioned individually. Miss Marple, who had remained, an unobtrusive figure on the edge of the crowd, was now positioned in the back corner of Mrs. Bertram's drawing room, sipping from a dainty cup of tea and observing the proceedings with quiet interest. The other guests, while attempting to maintain their composure, were clearly shaken. Mrs. Bertram had retired to a corner, hands clasped tightly in front of her face pale and drawn. Her usual poise had been replaced by a faint tremble, though she still managed to entertain the officers with polite niceties and occasional references to Miss Parsons's impeccable character. Clara Wren, the vicar's wife, had taken it upon herself to comfort the guests who were most affected. Though Clara was normally a woman of bustling energy, now she moved from person to person, offering gentle words of sympathy and attempting to soothe frayed nerves. She gave Miss Marple an occasional anxious glance, as though she expected her friend to step in and offer a grand solution to the crime. But Miss Marple, though deeply observant, was in no rush to offer any conclusions. She wasn't blind to the chaos around her or the unnatural quiet that had settled upon the room. but she preferred to let others expose their own thoughts and suspicions first. The more she watched, the more she knew that her methodical approach, patience, and careful listening was far more useful than rushing to judgment. In the meantime, Officer Crawley, who was clearly out of his depth, seemed more intent on questioning the villagers about their whereabouts than truly investigating the circumstances of Miss Parsons's death. His questions came in rapid succession, often more concerned with the social relations of the suspects than the crime itself. His usual caseload consisted of lost sheep and the occasional bout of mischief among the local children, not murder. "Where were you when it happened, Mrs. Bertram?" he asked, his voice tense as he scribbled notes. He kept his eyes trained on his notepad as though it was an anchor in the sea of panic around him. Mrs. Bertram shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "I was right here, as you can see, overseeing the guests and the food. I was only a few feet away from the scene," she replied, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain composed. I had no idea something like this could happen here." Miss Marple, listening from her corner, couldn't help but notice how quickly Mrs. Bertram had assumed the role of the victim. It wasn't unusual for people in positions of authority to try to retain control during times of crisis, but the air of her helplessness felt just a bit too rehearsed. Miss Marple's eyes flickered briefly to the far side of the room, where Douglas Phillimore stood watching the exchange, his hands tucked behind his back, his posture as rigid as ever. Phillimore had said nothing since the discovery of the body. His silence was not one of shock, as with many others, but of deep contemplation. His eyes, which had previously been icy and detached, now narrowed slightly as they swept the room, taking in the reactions of each person in turn. There was no hint of grief or confusion on his face, only the calm observance of a man who saw the murder as a puzzle, one that he perhaps already believed he could solve. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer than necessary, noting the slight tilt of his chin, the almost imperceptible set of his jaw. She could see why he had been placed at the center of suspicion by some of the more excitable villagers, but she wasn't so quick to judge. Not yet. "Dr. Parsons, you were among the first to approach the body. What did you find?" Officer Crawley asked, turning his attention to the doctor, who had been pacing uneasily by the window. The man was clearly unsettled by the circumstances, his usually composed demeanor cracking beneath the weight of what had transpired. I didn't find much," Dr. Parsons stammered. Her pulse was gone, of course, but there was nothing unusual. She had no wounds, no obvious signs of a struggle. I could only confirm that she was dead." Miss Marple's attention sharpened. No wounds, no signs of a struggle. Miss Parsons had been killed, but there was no violent scene. The blood around her head, the way she had collapsed, something about it didn't sit right. Dr. Parsons continued to speak, his voice growing more frantic. "I can't understand it, Jane. She was perfectly healthy. I saw her just yesterday." Miss Marple's brow furrowed slightly at his words. There was an edge to Dr. Parsons's voice, a sense of guilt that was hard to ignore. Perhaps he had been too close to Miss Parsons. Perhaps there was something in their relationship that warranted further exploration. But for now, Miss Marple chose not to pry, at least not yet. As the investigation continued, the guests were slowly ushered out of the room to make way for further questioning. The small group, clearly shaken, began to disperse in murmurs, casting furtive glances at one another. The whispers in the room became a buzzing hum as the villagers tried to make sense of the tragedy that had unfolded in their midst. Miss Marple watched it all with a quiet, detached curiosity. It was always like this in St. Mary's when something went awry. Rumors would spread, opinions would clash, and everyone would rush to find someone to blame. But there was one thing Miss Marple knew that no one else seemed to remember. Nothing was ever as it seemed in a village like this. Everyone wore a mask, whether they knew it or not. As she sat there sipping her tea and letting the words of the guests wash over her, she could feel the weight of the mystery settling in. There were no obvious suspects, no glaring signs that pointed directly to the killer. What she had seen so far, the body, the suspects, the disjointed reactions of the guests, were all part of the game. It was only a matter of time before someone let something slip, and when they did, Miss Marple would be ready. She took another sip of her tea and smiled faintly. The game had only just begun, and Miss Marple had a rare gift for seeing things others missed. Slowly, the first layer of the mystery would begin to peel away, revealing the secrets that the villagers had so carefully hidden. As the evening drew on, the villagers retired to their homes, casting long shadows in the dimming light. The police had done what they could, questioning the witnesses, securing the area, and searching for any clues. But Miss Marple knew the truth lay not in the evidence of the crime, but in the people themselves. She rose from her seat and made her way toward the door, her mind already racing with the possibilities. It was only a matter of time before she uncovered the key to the mystery, and when she did, the village of St. Mary's would never be the same again. The morning after the murder, the village of St. Mary's seemed to have regressed to an unsettling stillness. It was as if the events of the previous day had never happened, the sun rising as innocently as it always did, casting long shadows over the cobblestone streets. The locals, however, carried an air of unease. Conversations that had once been lively and unguarded now whispered in hushed tones, eyes darting nervously at one another as though the walls themselves might be listening. The murder of Miss Parsons had cast a shadow over the village, one that would be hard to shake. Miss Marple had spent the night in her small, neat cottage, her mind still restless with thoughts of the previous day's events. As she had predicted, nothing was as it seemed, and yet there were too many tangled threads to follow at once. The clues, as always, would need careful untangling, one at a time. She had always believed that the truth didn't just appear in a flash of brilliance. It was hidden in the mundane, in the things people overlooked, and in the moments they took for granted. The early morning sun had barely crested the horizon when Miss Marple made her way to the village square, a small, bustling area lined with shops. As usual, she was dressed in a simple, unassuming outfit, a lavender hat perched atop her head, and a small handbag hanging from her arm. Despite the ordinary appearance, there was nothing unremarkable about the sharpness of her eyes, or the subtle but keen awareness that marked her every movement. The constable had spent much of the previous day fumbling through interviews with the guests, but Miss Marple knew better than to rely solely on the official investigation. She had learned long ago that it was the unofficial observations, the unnoticed details that revealed the true story. After all, the people in this village weren't hardened criminals. They were, for the most part, regular folk with deep-seated fears, desires, and resentments. It was those quiet truths, those everyday sins and secrets, that would eventually lead her to the killer. As she entered the square, Miss Marple paused in front of the butcher's shop, where the butcher, a burly man with a ruddy complexion, was wiping down the window. His movements were slow, deliberate, as though the weight of the previous day still hung heavy on him. He looked up when he noticed Miss Marple standing there, offering her a forced smile. "Morning, Miss Marple," he greeted her, his voice gruff but polite. "Good morning, Mr. Mayfield," Miss Marple replied, her tone pleasant, but her eyes never leaving his face. "I trust the village is settling back to normal after yesterday's events?" Mr. Mayfield's brow furrowed slightly. Well, you know how these things are. Never thought something like that'd happen here of all places." "Indeed," Miss Marple mused, nodding sympathetically. She had noticed the slight shift in his eyes as she spoke, the brief hesitation in his words. There was something there, something that didn't sit right. He wasn't afraid of the murder, no. That would have been a normal reaction. But there was something else, an unease that went beyond the usual shock. "Tell me, Mr. Mayfield," she said, her voice taking on a softer tone. "Did you happen to notice anything unusual in the days leading up to Miss Parsons's death? Anything at all? I'm sure you must have seen quite a lot with all the people passing through your shop." The butcher shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the ground as he cleared his throat. "Well, I don't know as I saw anything, miss, but I did hear tell that Miss Parsons and the doctor, well, they weren't getting along too well. At least that's what the gossipers were saying." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Oh, and what sort of gossip might that have been?" "Nothing solid, just talk, he replied quickly, wiping his hands on his apron. "Some said she was too friendly with other men, and the doctor didn't like it. But like I said, just talk. Miss Marple let the silence stretch for a moment, her gaze unwavering. I see. Thank you for sharing that with me, Mr. Mayfield. Mr. Mayfield. If you happen to remember anything else, you'll let me know, won't you? Of course, Miss Marple, he said, though his eyes were already looking back down at his work, eager to return to the comfort of the familiar. As Miss Marple continued, on her way, she couldn't help but feel a small spark of interest. The insinuation about Miss Parsons and Dr. Parsons wasn't new. It had been whispered about for months, if not longer, but hearing it from someone who had no personal interest in the matter gave it a peculiar weight. It was, as the butcher had said, only gossip. But in Miss Marple's experience, gossip often had a kernel of truth buried somewhere deep inside it. She walked on, taking a slow, steady pace as she made her way toward the local post office. Inside, the postmaster, a mild-mannered man named Mr. Thorne, greeted her warmly. "Good morning, Miss Marple. I trust you're well?" "As well as can be expected," Miss Marple replied, her voice light but her eyes sharp. "I wanted to ask you, Mr. Thorne, whether you noticed anything out of the ordinary over the last few days. Perhaps any visitors or deliveries that seemed unusual?" Mr. Thorne paused for a moment, his brow furrowing slightly in thought. "Well, now that you mention it, there was a letter for Miss Parsons that came in last week. It was quite an odd thing. No return address, just her name scrawled on the front. She didn't seem too happy when she received it either. I thought it strange, but I didn't think much of it at the time." "A letter, you say?" Miss Marple repeated, her interest piqued. "Did she ever mention it to you?" "No, she didn't," Mr. Thorne admitted, his voice lowering as though the very mention of the letter might stir up something unpleasant. "But she did look troubled. I thought it might have something to do with the doctor, to be honest. She always looked upset after a visit from him." Miss Marple nodded, filing the information away. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne. If anything else comes to mind, I would be grateful to hear it." "Of course, Miss Marple," the postmaster replied, giving her a respectful nod. As Miss Marple left the post office, her thoughts were racing. The mystery was starting to take shape, but it was still too early to draw any firm conclusions. There were too many possibilities, too many angles to consider. The letter, the gossip about Miss Parsons and her husband, Dr. Parsons's strange behavior, all of it pointed to a deeper story, but the pieces had not yet clicked into place. She continued her walk through the village, taking the time to observe, to listen, and to reflect. The villagers' reactions had been telling. Mrs. Bertram's over-the-top distress had been hard to ignore. But what about her strange fixation on Miss Parsons? What about Douglas Phillimore, the new solicitor? His aloof demeanor only made him more suspicious in the eyes of many, yet he had not shown even a flicker of emotion during the questioning. Was that a sign of guilt, or simply the behavior of someone who had seen too much of human nature to be rattled? There were many questions yet to be answered, and Miss Marple knew better than to rush into conclusions. As she approached the green in the center of the village, she paused to look around, taking in the peaceful surroundings. The clues were out there, waiting for someone to see them, and in time, Miss Marple would unravel them all, piece by piece. The morning after her quiet inquiries, Miss Marple sat in her small, cozy sitting room, a cup of tea cradled in her hands. The room was as unremarkable as the woman herself, neatly arranged with floral-patterned cushions and a few well-worn bookshelves filled with novels, mysteries, and the occasional weathered memoir. Her cottage, though humble, was an oasis of comfort. Yet today, her mind was far from the peace the room offered. The murder of Miss Parsons had sparked a quiet storm in St. Mary's, and Miss Marple was certain the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place. But just how they fit together remained elusive. She had already gathered several strands of information over the past 24 hours, small threads of gossip and half-formed opinions from the villagers, but what she hadn't yet discovered was the key that would make all of this make sense. The letter, the strained relationship between Miss Parsons and Dr. Parsons, and the cold distance of Douglas Phillimore had raised her suspicions, but none of it yet formed a clear picture. It was time to examine the first suspects more closely. As she sat with her tea, Miss Marple pondered the two main individuals who had already caught her attention: Dr. Gerald Parsons and Douglas Phillimore. The doctor, a man who had been close to Miss Parsons, seemed to be the most obvious person of interest given their apparent tension. But Miss Marple was no fool. She knew better than to rely on the obvious. Often, the solution was hidden in plain sight, obscured by distractions. Then there was Douglas Phillimore. His behavior was equally curious. Though he was not a part of the established social fabric of St. Mary's, he had been in town long enough to become an enigma, one who kept his distance from the townsfolk and yet seemed to take a quiet interest in the events surrounding the murder. His aloof demeanor made him a prime candidate for suspicion. But Miss Marple knew well that appearances were often misleading. She needed to look deeper. Miss Marple stood, leaving her tea unfinished, and walked to the window, her eyes scanning the village. It was early afternoon, and the village was as peaceful as ever. No sign of the tumult that had accompanied the discovery of Miss Parsons's body. The world outside carried on, unbothered by the murder that had shattered its stillness. But beneath that calm exterior, Miss Marple could feel the undercurrent of tension, the quiet dread that lingered in every corner of the village. She walked out the door of her cottage and made her way to the doctor's surgery. Dr. Gerald Parsons's office was a small, unassuming building near the center of the village. It was the sort of place one might expect from a country doctor, simple, functional, and without any of the ornate touches of wealth or grandeur. Miss Marple knocked lightly on the door before entering. "Ah, Miss Marple," Dr. Parsons greeted her, his voice a little too strained to be natural. "What brings you here today?" "I do hope I'm not disturbing you, Dr. Parsons," Miss Marple said with a smile. "I just thought I'd stop by and see how you're holding up after the tragic events of yesterday." The doctor's face twitched. "It's been a difficult day. Thank you for asking." Miss Marple sat in the chair opposite his desk, watching him carefully. Dr. Parsons was a man in his early 40s, with a prematurely graying beard and sharp eyes that never quite met hers. His posture was tense, his hands fidgeting nervously, with a pen as he sat down. "I can imagine how hard this must be for you," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but purposeful. "After all, you and Miss Parsons were so close. It must have been quite a shock to lose her in such a way." Dr. Parsons's eyes flickered for just a moment before he regained his composure. "Yes, it was unexpected. But these things happen, Miss Marple. Life goes on, doesn't it?" Miss Marple nodded, but her eyes never left him. "Of course, life does go on. But I must ask you, Doctor, was there anything unusual in the days leading up to Miss Parsons's death? Anything that might have caused her distress? Perhaps something you noticed that didn't seem quite right?" Dr. Parsons's hands gripped the pen tightly. "Nothing out of the ordinary. She was always a little difficult at times. But I wouldn't say there was anything that should have led to something like this." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But it's true, isn't it? That there were rumors. That there was some friction between the two of you? People have been talking about it, Doctor." Dr. Parsons' face flushed, and he stood up abruptly. "Rumors are just that. Rumors, Miss Marple. I don't pay them any mind." "I understand," Miss Marple said, her voice soothing, as though she were placating a child. "But you see, Doctor, rumors often have a kernel of truth to them. And in this case, those rumors are telling me that there's more to your relationship with Miss Parsons than meets the eye." The doctor hesitated, his hand hovering near the door as though he were considering an escape. He swallowed hard before speaking again, his voice more measured. "Is there a point to this conversation, Miss Marple?" he asked, his tone sharp. Miss Marple rose from her seat and smiled gently. "Oh, of course. I'm sorry if I've made you uncomfortable, but I'm merely trying to understand the dynamics of the village, you see. Everyone has their secrets after all. It's only a matter of time before they come to light." Dr. Parsons said nothing more, but the tension in the room was palpable. Miss Marple made her way to the door, but before she left, she turned and gave the doctor one last look. "I do hope we can speak again soon, Doctor. It's important to understand these things fully. Perhaps you'll think of something in the coming days that might help." Dr. Parsons's eyes narrowed, but he didn't respond. Miss Marple left the office without another word, feeling the weight of her conversation hang in the air. The next stop on Miss Marple's quiet investigation was to see Douglas Phillimore. He had been somewhat aloof during the questioning yesterday, offering little insight into the tragedy. His distant manner seemed out of place among the more anxious and worried villagers, and Miss Marple couldn't help but wonder why he had chosen to keep his distance. She found him outside his modest home, standing at the front gate as though waiting for something, or someone. When he saw her approaching, he gave a slight nod, his expression unreadable. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," he said politely, though there was no warmth in his voice. "Good afternoon, Mr. Phillimore," Miss Marple replied, offering him a pleasant smile. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "What can I do for you?" Miss Marple regarded him carefully for a moment before speaking. "I just wanted to check in with you, Mr. Phillimore. You must be shaken by the events of yesterday. Everyone in the village is quite rattled by what happened to Miss Parsons." He nodded slowly, though his eyes gave away little emotion. "It's a terrible thing, of course, but I didn't know Miss Parsons very well. We had only just met, after all." Miss Marple watched him closely, noting the slight shift in his posture. He had been in the village long enough to know that the death of Miss Parsons would affect everyone, whether they knew her personally or not. And yet, he spoke as though the murder was a distant event, something that hadn't touched him at all. "I understand," Miss Marple said, her voice soft and probing. "But you were there yesterday, during the questioning. It must have been hard to stand aside while everyone else was so upset." Phillimore's eyes flickered, but he quickly regained his composure. "I wasn't involved in the drama, Miss Marple. I prefer to keep to myself." "Of course," Miss Marple said, nodding. "But there's one thing I find curious, Mr. Phillimore. You were standing by the garden wall, watching the commotion, almost as though you were observing from a distance." Phillimore stiffened, and Miss Marple could see the faintest flash of something in his eyes. Whether it was guilt, discomfort, or something else, she couldn't be sure. "It was a public event," he replied coolly. "I was watching, yes, but I didn't see anything that would interest you." Miss Marple smiled softly. "Perhaps not, Mr. Phillimore, but I do wonder if you saw something that you haven't shared yet." Phillimore said nothing in response, but Miss Marple didn't need an answer. She already knew that the pieces were beginning to fall into place. Slowly, imperceptibly, but steadily. The days that followed Miss Marple's conversations with Dr. Parsons and Douglas Phillimore seemed to stretch on endlessly, each passing hour thick with suspicion and uncertainty. The village, despite its outward calm, buzzed with a quiet, nervous energy. Everyone had their theories, some more elaborate than others, and in the absence of clear evidence, whispers filled the spaces where facts should have been. Gossip, as Miss Marple had long known, was both a shield and a weapon, a means by which the truth was both hidden and revealed. Miss Marple's early investigations had drawn her toward two figures in particular: Dr. Parsons, the seemingly grieving husband with a hidden edge, and Douglas Phillimore, the outsider whose cold, distant presence made him the perfect scapegoat. Both had behaved oddly during the aftermath of Miss Parsons's death, but Miss Marple was well aware that appearances could be deceiving. The truth, as always, lay in the smaller, overlooked details, the ones that no one else seemed to notice. Her thoughts had been whirling, chasing shadows of clues that refused to materialize, when something, an insignificant moment, caught her attention. It was the smallest of things, almost laughable in its simplicity, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that no detail was too trivial. In fact, sometimes the most insignificant things turned out to be the key to unraveling the most intricate mysteries. It was a chilly morning when Miss Marple decided to pay another visit to Mrs. Bertram's house. Despite her initial curiosity regarding the garden party and the events that followed, Miss Marple had been careful not to overlook Mrs. Bertram, who, in her grief and her social position, might have something important to offer. The widow had been deeply distressed by Miss Parsons's death, but Miss Marple had noticed, in the days following the murder, that Mrs. Bertram had grown somewhat evasive. The house, though grand and stately, had an almost oppressive air about it now. Miss Marple could feel the weight of its walls, filled with long-held secrets and stories of days gone by. The door creaked slightly as Miss Marple pushed it open, the familiar smell of roses and old furniture greeting her. Mrs. Bertram was sitting at her usual place by the large window in the sitting room, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Miss Marple," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wasn't expecting you today. Is everything all right?" "I do hope I'm not disturbing you," Miss Marple replied, her voice warm yet purposeful. "I just thought I'd drop by and see how you're doing. I know this must be a difficult time for you with everything that's happened." Mrs. Bertram's eyes darkened slightly, and she gave a weary sigh. "It's been dreadful, Jane. Absolutely dreadful. I simply cannot understand how something like this could happen in our village." She looked down at her hands, folding and unfolding them nervously. Miss Marple settled into the chair across from her, offering a gentle, understanding smile. "I know how hard this must be for you, and it's natural to want answers, to want to understand why something so terrible has happened. But you see, Mrs. Bertram, it's often the little things, the smallest clues, that help us uncover the truth." Mrs. Bertram raised an eyebrow at her hand stilling in her lap. "Clues? What do you mean, Jane?" Miss Marple leaned in slightly, her tone soft but insistent. "I mean the things that don't seem important at first. The things that people overlook in their haste to find a simple explanation. I've been thinking, you see, about how much we all hide behind our masks, how our past shape what we do in the present." Mrs. Bertram's eyes flickered, and Miss Marple caught the briefest shadow of something in her expression. Was it fear? Was it guilt? Miss Marple couldn't be sure, but there was something there. Something she hadn't noticed before. "I don't understand what you mean," Mrs. Bertram said quietly, though Miss Marple could sense the underlying tension in her voice. "It's a matter of timing, you see," Miss Marple continued, her voice slow and deliberate. "I've been thinking about the garden party. You were all there when Miss Parsons was discovered, but what happened right before? What did you see? Or, perhaps, what didn't you see?" Mrs. Bertram shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her hands clutching the edges of her chair. "I don't know what you mean, Jane. I told the police everything I knew. I was only a few steps away when it happened. I didn't notice anything out of the ordinary." Miss Marple gave a small nod, her gaze never wavering. "Yes, but you see, Mrs. Bertram, there's something curious about the door to your study, the one Miss Parsons was found near. The door that was locked from the inside, if I'm not mistaken." Mrs. Bertram's face paled slightly, and she quickly turned her gaze away, as though she were searching for something to focus on outside the window. I don't know much about that. I wasn't involved in the investigation, Miss Marple. You mustn't trouble yourself with these things." Miss Marple's smile was soft but knowing. "Oh, but I must, Mrs. Bertram. You see, it's the door that has me thinking. It was locked from the inside, yet Miss Parsons was lying in the garden, her body in full view of everyone. How could she have gotten there? And why was the door locked from the inside?" The question hung in the air, and Miss Marple could see that Mrs. Bertram was trying to maintain her composure, but the facade was cracking. Her fingers twitched nervously, her gaze darting between Miss Marple and the window. Finally, with a resigned sigh, Mrs. Bertram spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want anyone to know, but I think I saw something the day before. Something that didn't sit right with me." Miss Marple leaned forward, her interest piqued. "What did you see, Mrs. Bertram?" Mrs. Bertram hesitated for a long moment, as if weighing the decision in her mind. Then, in a hushed tone, she confessed, "It was Phillimore. He was near the study, standing by the door, when Miss Parsons went inside. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now I'm wondering, why was he there? Why did he look so intent on watching her? It wasn't like him." Miss Marple's mind raced. Phillimore, the solicitor. She had noticed his strange behavior before, but now, hearing this from Mrs. Bertram, a new suspicion arose. He had been watching Miss Parsons. But why? Had he been involved in the murder somehow? "Thank you for telling me, Mrs. Bertram," Miss Marple said softly, her voice almost a whisper. This is very important information. I'll need to follow up on it, of course. Mrs. Bertram nodded, though her face remained drawn and pale. I don't know if I'm doing the right thing, Jane. I don't want to cause trouble. You've done the right thing, Mrs. Bertram, Miss Marple assured her, rising from her seat. Sometimes the truth is buried in the most unlikely of places, and sometimes it takes a bit of courage to bring it to the surface. As Miss Marple left Mrs. Bertram's house, she couldn't shake the feeling that the door, the locked door, was a symbol of more than just a physical barrier. It was a barrier to the truth, a key that would unlock the mystery if she could only find the right way to open it. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to come together, but there was still much work to be done. Philemore's strange behavior, Mrs. Bertram's cryptic admission, and the locked door, it was all starting to make sense. But Miss Marple knew that the final revelation would be a delicate matter. There was still one more thing she had to do before the truth could be fully uncovered. The next few days passed with a curious sense of quiet tension hanging over St. Mary's. The murder of Miss Parsons, though the talk of the village was now tempered by the steady hum of life moving forward. Yet beneath the surface there was a palpable unease. Even the familiar sights, the old bakery on the corner, the laughter of children running down the lane, the smell of fresh bread wafting through the air, seemed a little dimmer, a little more muted, as if the village itself were holding its breath. Miss Marple, ever the observer, had not ceased her investigation. Her mind, sharp as ever, had been piecing together the fragments of information she had gathered, and now the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together in a way that left little room for doubt. The locked door, Mrs. Bertram's cryptic words, and the strange behavior of Douglas Philemore had given her a clear direction to pursue, but there was still much to uncover. She had already learned more than most of the villagers realized. Dr. Parsons, despite his outward grief, had revealed a certain defensiveness, an undercurrent of something unspoken. The rumors about his relationship with Miss Parsons had, unsurprisingly, been true. Their marriage, though outwardly stable, had been strained by tensions neither of them had been willing to acknowledge. The doctor had been a man used to controlling his environment, his practice, his patients, even his marriage, and when that control had slipped, he had retreated behind the walls of denial. Then there was Douglas Philemore, the solicitor who had recently moved to St. Mary's. His aloof demeanor and refusal to engage with the villagers had made him an object of suspicion from the start. His involvement with Miss Parsons, if any, remained unclear, but his odd behavior at the garden party, the way he had stood so rigidly against the garden wall, watching the commotion with a strange detachment, spoke volumes. Why had he been there, watching from the shadows? But it was Mrs. Bertram's revelation about Philemore's presence by the study door, watching Miss Parsons, that had cemented Miss Marple's suspicion. He had been too interested in the victim's movements, too observant of her comings and goings. And now the missing link in the puzzle was beginning to emerge. The locked door to the study. The door that had been locked from the inside. Miss Marple had already visited Mrs. Bertram's house once more, but this time she had been unable to gather any further information. Mrs. Bertram had been unusually quiet, perhaps realizing that she had already said too much. It was as if the weight of the mystery had begun to press on her, and Miss Marple knew that there was still much hidden behind the walls of the grand house. Now it was time to confront the key players directly. Miss Marple arrived at Dr. Parsons's surgery just after lunch, her steps deliberate, her mind already calculating the best approach. Dr. Parsons had become increasingly difficult to read, his behavior swinging between outward calm and sudden, unexplained bursts of agitation. It was time to address the elephant in the room, the strained relationship between him and his wife, and see whether the truth would finally emerge. The door to the surgery creaked open as Miss Marple stepped inside. Dr. Parsons was seated at his desk, his brow furrowed as he wrote something in his ledger. He looked up at her entrance, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Miss Marple," he greeted her with a forced smile. "What can I do for you today?" "I do hope I'm not interrupting," Miss Marple said with her customary gentleness. "I just wanted to follow up on a few things regarding Miss Parsons's untimely death." Dr. Parsons stiffened at the mention of his wife, his jaw tightening. "I've already spoken to the authorities about that, Miss Marple. There's nothing more to add." Miss Marple, unfazed by his defensive tone, lowered herself into the chair across from him. Of course, but you see, Doctor, sometimes it's the things that go unsaid that matter most. He met her gaze for a long moment, and Miss Marple could see the flicker of something, fear, guilt, or perhaps something darker, pass across his face before he masked it. Finally, he spoke, his voice carefully controlled. What is it that you think you know, Miss Marple? If you have questions, you'd best ask the authorities. I'm simply a man trying to cope with the loss of my wife. Miss Marple regarded him, silently for a moment, her eyes thoughtful. I know that you and Miss Parsons were having some difficulties, she said quietly. And I know that sometimes, when things aren't as they seem, people go to great lengths to protect themselves. Dr. Parsons's eyes hardened, and he leaned forward, his fingers pressing against the desk. I have nothing to hide, Miss Marple. My wife and I had our disagreements, but they were nothing more than what any married couple goes through. There was no reason for anyone to harm her. But what if someone thought there was a reason? Miss Marple asked softly, her tone almost imperceptible. What if someone felt as though they had been wronged by her, or even by you? The room seemed to grow colder, the silence stretching between them. Finally, Dr. Parsons stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. I don't need to justify myself to you, Miss Marple. I have already told you everything I know. You can spin your theories all you like, but they won't change what happened. Miss Marple remained seated, her eyes never leaving him. You're right. They won't change what happened. But they might change how we understand it. Dr. Parsons' jaw clenched again, and for a moment it seemed as though he might say something more. But instead he turned away, his back to her as he walked to the window. Miss Marple rose, offering him one last look before she turned to leave. Goodbye, Doctor, she said quietly. I do hope you find peace. Miss Marple's next visit was to see Douglas Phillimore. The solicitor's house was small but neat, tucked away behind a well-kept hedge at the edge of the village. Miss Marple had already gathered enough to know that Phillimore had been hiding something, but it was time for him to explain himself. As she approached the door, she was greeted by the sound of footsteps inside, followed by the soft click of the lock as it turned. Phillimore opened the door, his expression as unreadable as ever. Miss Marple, he said, his voice steady but with an underlying tension. What brings you here today? I'm afraid I must trouble you once again, Mr. Phillimore, Miss Marple said, her tone polite yet firm. I have a few questions about your behavior during the garden party. You see, I've been thinking about the moments before Miss Parsons was found, and there's one thing that doesn't quite add up. Phillimore raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a thin smile. Oh? And what would that be? The door to Mrs. Bertram's study, Miss Marple said, her voice unruffled. The one that was locked from the inside. You were seen standing by it the day before Miss Parsons's death. Why were you there, Mr. Phillimore? And why were you so interested in her movements? Phillimore's smile faltered, and for the first time, Miss Marple saw a flicker of something in his eyes, fear, or perhaps guilt. He didn't respond immediately, his gaze shifting to the side before he looked back at her. I had my reasons for being there, he said, his voice low. But you're wrong if you think I had anything to do with her death. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, studying him. We all have our reasons, Mr. Phillimore. But I believe you're hiding something. His expression darkened, and Miss Marple knew that the final confrontation was close at hand, but she also knew that the truth was closer than ever. The days following her confrontation with Dr. Parsons and Douglas Phillimore were marked by an eerie quiet in St. Mary's. The village had settled into a false semblance of normality, as though the dark shadow cast by Miss Parsons's death had faded with the passing days. Yet Miss Marple knew better than to believe in such appearances. The truth was lurking just beneath the surface, and every day she found herself drawing closer to its revelation. She had seen the flicker of something in both Dr. Parsons and Phillimore, a slip of the mask, an unguarded moment that spoke volumes. But there was still something more, a final piece of the puzzle that eluded her grasp. She could feel it in her bones. The killer was close, and all she had to do was find the last hidden clue to connect everything. It was a bright, chilly afternoon when Miss Marple decided to pay another visit to the scene of the crime, the study in Mrs. Bertram's house. She had already questioned the inhabitants, but there was something about the study that called to her. Perhaps it was the door itself, the one that had been locked from the inside. Something about the way it had been described by the constable, and later by Mrs. Bertram, had never quite sat right with her. Why had the door been locked from the inside? What did that door truly hide? Arriving at the grand house, Miss Marple was greeted by Mrs. Bertram with the same somber smile she had worn since the murder. The widow had seemed more distant than before, as though she had something to protect, and Miss Marple wasn't one to let such a hint pass by unnoticed. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Bertram said, her voice softer than usual, "I'm afraid I don't have much more to add to what I've already told you. The village is still in shock, and I'm hardly the one to provide any real answers." "Not answers, Mrs. Bertram," Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle. "Just more questions. You see, I've been thinking more about Miss Parsons' death, and I believe there's something in the house, perhaps in the study, that might offer us a few more clues." Mrs. Bertram hesitated, a fleeting shadow of unease passing over her face. She looked toward the study door, her lips pressing together as if fighting the urge to say something. Miss Marple noticed the slight change in Mrs. Bertram's expression, the tension that had seeped into her features. "I don't know what you think you'll find, Miss Marple," Mrs. Bertram said finally, her words slow and deliberate. "The door has been locked ever since the tragedy. I thought perhaps it was best left undisturbed." "But it's precisely that door that concerns me," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but insistent. "It was locked from the inside, you see. Yet Miss Parsons's body was found outside. What was she doing near the door? What happened in that study that led to her death?" Mrs. Bertram swallowed, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her tea. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. There was more here than the widow was letting on, something hidden behind her well-maintained composure. "Would it be possible for me to see the study again, Mrs. Bertram?" Miss Marple asked, her voice quiet but firm. For a long moment, Mrs. Bertram said nothing. Her gaze flickered from Miss Marple to the study door and back again. Then, with a reluctant nod, she rose from her chair and led Miss Marple to the room. The study was much as it had been before, neat, orderly, and filled with the unmistakable scent of polished wood and old books. But Miss Marple's eyes immediately went to the door, the one that had been locked from the inside. The door itself was a sturdy, well-crafted piece of furniture, its brass handle gleaming in the dim light of the room. "It's strange," Mrs. Bertram said, her voice quiet as they both stood before the door. "I locked the door myself when I went to check the room that morning. It was locked, just as I had left it. But when the constable arrived, the key was still inside. It didn't make sense." Miss Marple studied the door carefully, her mind running through the possibilities. She had already suspected that the lock had been tampered with, but the exact nature of how it had been done still eluded her. Miss Parsons had been found outside, but someone had been inside this room, someone who knew how to manipulate the lock without leaving a trace. "I see," Miss Marple murmured. "It's certainly an unusual thing to have happened. And yet it's possible that the key wasn't the only thing inside this room that's important." Mrs. Bertram frowned. "What do you mean, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple stepped forward, her hand brushing lightly against the edge of the desk. There was something about the desk, a small drawer, slightly ajar, that caught her attention. She had seen the desk when she had visited before, but at that time, she hadn't examined it closely. Now, with the room silent and still, Miss Marple moved toward the desk with a renewed focus. She opened the drawer slowly, her eyes scanning its contents. It was mostly filled with papers, letters, bills, and receipts, but there, at the very bottom of the drawer, was a small, folded piece of paper. It was tucked away so carefully that it seemed almost hidden from view. Miss Marple took the paper, her hands steady, and unfolded it with a quiet precision. The writing was hasty, but legible. It was a note, written in a hurried scrawl. "I know what you did. You'll pay for it." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. The note was damning, but who had written it? And why had it been tucked away in this drawer? More importantly, why had it not been found earlier? She turned to Mrs. Bertram, who stood frozen in the doorway, her face drained of color. The widow's eyes flickered from the note to Miss Marple, and for the first time, Miss Marple saw something like fear in her eyes. "Mrs. Bertram," Miss Marple said softly, her voice cutting through the thick silence. "Who left this note here?" Mrs. Bertram swallowed hard, her throat constricting. I don't know. I didn't see it before. I swear, Miss Marple, I had no idea it was there." But Miss Marple wasn't so sure. The note was a crucial piece of evidence, and Mrs. Bertram's reaction was telling. Miss Marple had already suspected that the widow was hiding something. But this was different. This note could be the key to everything, the hidden clue that would finally unlock the mystery of Miss Parsons's death. "It seems we're getting closer to the truth," Miss Marple said, her voice low, almost to herself, "but I fear there's still much left to uncover." As she left the study, Miss Marple's mind raced. The note, the locked door, the tensions in the village, everything was beginning to fit together in a way that left her with a chilling certainty. The killer was not as far from her reach as they had once seemed, but before the final revelation could come, Miss Marple knew she needed to confront one last person, the one who had written the note, the one who had left a threat in the drawer of that study. The game was not over yet, and Miss Marple was ready to play her final hand. The discovery of the note had been an unexpected twist, one that Miss Marple had not anticipated, but now believed to be the key to solving the mystery of Miss Parsons's death. As she sat quietly in her cottage that evening, the paper in front of her, the words scrawled on it reverberated in her mind. "I know what you did. You'll pay for it." Who had written it? And what exactly had they meant by what you did? The clues were slowly starting to align in Miss Marple's mind, and she knew there was still one final person to confront. She had her suspicions, of course, but now it was time to put them to the test. The note, tucked away in Mrs. Bertram's desk, had been the missing piece. Mrs. Bertram's reaction to its discovery had been telling. It had been too quick, too defensive. She had tried to deny it, but there was something in her eyes, something she hadn't been able to hide, that told Miss Marple there was more to the widow's involvement than met the eye. But it wasn't just Mrs. Bertram who had caught Miss Marple's attention. The entire village seemed to be hiding something. Everyone, it seemed, had their secrets. The locked door, the strange relationships, the whispered gossip, all of it pointed to an intricate web of deception, and Miss Marple had already begun to untangle it. There was no more time to waste. She needed to confront the widow one final time. She had already given her a chance to explain, but now Miss Marple would push her to reveal the truth. The truth, after all, was the only thing that could restore peace to the village and to the memory of Miss Parsons. Miss Marple arrived at Mrs. Bertram's house the following morning, just as the sun was beginning to filter through the trees. There was a stillness in the air, as though the house itself were holding its breath in anticipation of the conversation that was about to unfold. Mrs. Bertram greeted her at the door, her face pale and weary. She looked almost as though she had not slept the night before, the dark circles under her eyes betraying her sleeplessness. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said, her voice soft and almost apologetic. "I wasn't expecting you today. I'm afraid I have come to ask you a few more questions, Mrs. Bertram," Miss Marple said, her tone polite but firm. "I know we've already discussed everything that happened during the garden party, but I believe there's something we haven't yet addressed. Something important." Mrs. Bertram's gaze flickered nervously, and she stepped aside to let Miss Marple into the house. "What is it that you're looking for, Jane? I've already told you everything I know." Miss Marple didn't respond immediately. Instead, she took a seat by the window, allowing the silence to stretch out for a moment. She knew that silence could often make people uncomfortable, and she was hoping that it would push Mrs. Bertram to speak before Miss Marple had to ask the direct question. After a long moment, Mrs. Bertram shifted in her chair, her eyes downcast. "I don't know how much more I can help you. What else could there possibly be?" "Perhaps we should talk about the note," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but unyielding. Mrs. Bertram froze, her face going pale. The silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating. She didn't speak for a long time, and Miss Marple allowed the moment to linger. Finally, Mrs. Bertram spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never meant for you to find that," she said, her words heavy with guilt. "I didn't want anyone to know." "Tell me, Mrs. Bertram," Miss Marple continued, her tone calm, "who wrote the note, and what did it mean?" Mrs. Bertram's eyes flickered toward the study door, and for a brief moment Miss Marple saw something shift in her expression. Regret, fear, or perhaps a hint of shame. Mrs. Bertram's fingers twisted nervously in her lap. "It was from someone I once knew," she said, her voice faltering. "Someone I tried to forget." Miss Marple's gaze never left her. "Who, Mrs. Bertram? Who was it?" Mrs. Bertram's eyes flickered away, her voice barely audible. It was Douglas Phillimore." The name hung in the air like a weight, the sound of it echoing through the room. Miss Marple had suspected as much, but hearing it spoken aloud sent a shiver down her spine. The solicitor, the man who had been so aloof, so distant, he was involved after all. But how? And why? "You're saying Douglas Phillimore wrote the note?" Miss Marple asked, her voice soft but laced with disbelief. "But why? What could he possibly want from you?" Mrs. Bertram's hands tightened in her lap. "It's a long story, Jane, a very long story, and one I've tried to bury for years." Miss Marple waited patiently, allowing Mrs. Bertram the space to continue. "It was years ago, before my husband died," Mrs. Bertram began, her voice shaking slightly. "Douglas Phillimore was a young man back then, eager to make a name for himself in the village. He was an ambitious solicitor, and I was lonely. My husband, you see, had been ill for years, and I found comfort in Phillimore's attentions. At first, it was innocent. He offered legal advice, helped me with some of the estate matters, but as time went on, it became more." Miss Marple nodded gently, encouraging her to go on. "More? How?" Mrs. Bertram's eyes darted nervously around the room. "He made advances, subtle at first. He was kind, attentive, and I became attached to him. But when my husband found out, he became furious. Phillimore's career was at risk, and I knew I couldn't continue the affair. I ended it, and I thought it was over." "But it wasn't," Miss Marple said softly, her voice steady. Mrs. Bertram shook her head. "No, Phillimore threatened me. He told me that if I didn't keep quiet, he would ruin me. He knew about my husband's illness, about the way I had been vulnerable. I thought I had put it behind me, but when Miss Parsons came to the village, I began to feel like I was being watched again. And then the note arrived." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as the pieces began to fall into place. "Phillimore wanted to keep you quiet. He wanted to make sure that no one found out about his past with you. But Miss Parsons, she was a threat, wasn't she? She was the one who knew about his secrets, and when she threatened to expose him, he decided to act." Mrs. Bertram nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "I never wanted anyone to get hurt. I thought it was over, but now I'm afraid it's all come back. And Miss Parsons, she was the one who paid the price for my mistake." Miss Marple stood slowly, her eyes scanning the room one last time. "The truth, Mrs. Bertram, is always more complicated than we'd like it to be, but it always finds its way to the surface." As Miss Marple left Mrs. Bertram's house, the truth was finally clear in her mind. Douglas Phillimore had been the one to write the note, but it was his fear of exposure and his desire to silence Miss Parsons that had driven him to murder. The locked door had been his final attempt to cover his tracks. The pieces had come together. All that remained now was to confront Phillimore and expose his guilt for the village to see. The final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. Miss Marple's mind had worked tirelessly, unraveling each thread of suspicion, examining each piece of evidence. It had all led to one conclusion. Douglas Phillimore had been behind the murder of Miss Parsons, driven by his fear of being exposed for a past indiscretion with Mrs. Bertram. His desire to keep his secret buried had led him to take desperate measures. And yet even now, as the truth seemed so clear, Miss Marple knew she had to confront him, not just to confirm her suspicions, but to test his reaction. She had already gathered the key players, Dr. Parsons, Mrs. Bertram, and now Phillimore. Each had given her a piece of the story, but the final piece would come only when Phillimore was confronted with the undeniable evidence of his guilt. As Miss Marple walked toward Phillimore's house, the early evening air was crisp, the sky tinged with the last hints of daylight. The village was quiet, the streets still, but she knew that the storm was brewing, and it would not be long before the truth erupted. Miss Marple had already learned enough about Phillimore's character. He was methodical, cold, and calculated. He had shown no signs of panic during the investigation, just the same calm, detached demeanor that had characterized his behavior from the start. Yet, there was something in his eyes, something in the way he held himself that suggested he knew the walls were closing in. She knocked at his door, the sharp rap echoing through the silence of the evening. Phillimore opened the door almost immediately, his face impassive, though his eyes narrowed slightly when he saw who stood on the other side. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice cool but polite. "I wasn't expecting you. What can I do for you?" "I hope I'm not disturbing you, Mr. Phillimore," Miss Marple replied, her voice steady. "I've come to speak with you about something important. I believe the time has come for us to have a frank conversation." Phillimore stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. "I'm not sure what you mean, but of course you're welcome to speak." Miss Marple stepped into the modest, well-kept house, her eyes scanning the room for any subtle signs of unease. The walls were lined with bookshelves, and the furniture was simple yet elegant, reflecting the man's reserved nature. But as Miss Marple took in the surroundings, she couldn't help but feel a sense of coldness in the air, a deliberate detachment from the warmth of human connection. "Please, have a seat," Phillimore said, his voice smooth as he motioned to the armchair by the fireplace. He sat opposite her, folding his hands in his lap. Miss Marple settled into the chair, her posture straight and composed. "Mr. Phillimore, I've been doing some thinking about the events that led to Miss Parsons's death," she began, her voice measured and calm. "There are still many unanswered questions, but I believe the answers are closer than we realize." He raised an eyebrow, his expression betraying nothing. "Unanswered questions? I believe everything has been addressed, Miss Marple. The authorities have spoken to me, and I've told them all I know. There's nothing more to discuss." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, her gaze piercing. "You're quite certain of that, Mr. Phillimore? Because you see, I have reason to believe that there's something you're not telling me, something very important." Phillimore's calm demeanor faltered for the briefest moment, but it was enough for Miss Marple to notice. His eyes shifted, and his fingers tightened ever so slightly around the edge of his chair. It was a small reaction, but one that confirmed what Miss Marple had suspected. "Something I'm not telling you?" he repeated, his voice still smooth but with an edge of defensiveness creeping in. "I think you're mistaken, Miss Marple. I have no secrets." "Ah, but we all have secrets, don't we?" Miss Marple said softly. "Some of them are just more difficult to bury than others." For a long moment, Phillimore remained silent, his expression unreadable. Miss Marple watched him intently, her mind working with the precision of a seasoned detective. She knew that he was holding something back, that he was trying to maintain control of the conversation. But Miss Marple had no intention of allowing him to control the narrative. "You see, Mr. Phillimore," she continued, her voice dropping slightly, "the key to understanding what happened to Miss Parsons lies in something very simple, something overlooked by others, but something that caught my attention. The note." The word hung in the air like a bombshell, and Phillimore's eyes darkened. His reaction was swift. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing, and for the first time, Miss Marple saw the flicker of fear in his gaze. "What note?" he asked, his voice tight. Miss Marple didn't flinch. "The note that was hidden in Mrs. Bertram's study. The one that was meant for her. I know what you did. You'll pay for it." Phillimore's face went pale, and for a brief moment the facade slipped entirely. He was no longer the composed solicitor, but a man on the edge, struggling to maintain his composure. His hand clenched into a fist and his jaw tightened. "How did you find it?" he asked, his voice low and strained. I have my ways, Miss Marple replied with a gentle smile. But it was never a question of how I found it. It was a question of who left it there and why. Phillimore stared at her, his breath coming faster. For a moment, Miss Marple thought he might speak, but instead he rose abruptly from his chair and began pacing the room, his agitation growing with each step. You don't know what you're talking about, he muttered to himself, almost as if trying to convince himself. It's all just rumors, lies. Is it, Mr. Phillimore? Miss Marple interjected, her voice firm now. Because from where I stand, it looks like you've been running from the truth for a long time. And the truth has a way of catching up, doesn't it? Phillimore stopped pacing, his back to her now. For a long moment, he said nothing, and Miss Marple watched him closely, waiting for him to make the first move. He was cornered, and he knew it. Finally, he turned to face her, his face pale but resolute. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, he said, his voice thick with guilt. I never meant for anyone to die but she. She was going to ruin everything. She had to be stopped. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat as the words fell from his lips. Who was going to ruin everything, Mr. Phillimore? She asked softly. Miss Parsons, he replied, his voice breaking. She was going to expose me. She knew about the affair. With Mrs. Bertram, she knew about everything, and when she threatened to tell the whole village, I couldn't let that happen. I thought if I could scare her, make her back off. But she wouldn't listen. The silence that followed was suffocating. Phillimore's confession hung in the air, and Miss Marple, though she had suspected the truth for some time, felt a pang of sadness. He had been a man pushed to the edge, a man who had allowed his secrets to destroy him. How did you do it? Miss Marple asked quietly, her voice almost compassionate. I locked the door, he whispered, his voice hollow. And I waited. I knew she would come to the study. She always did. She always did. When she went inside, I locked it behind her. I wanted her to think she was trapped, that there was no way out. But she didn't die right away. She must have tried to get out, but the door wouldn't open. And then he trailed off, his face crumpling with remorse. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her heart heavy with the realization that Phillimore had indeed committed the crime. The piece of the puzzle was complete. Thank you for your honesty, Mr. Phillimore, she said, softly, though there was no satisfaction in her voice. The truth is always the hardest thing to face, but it's the only thing that can set us free. As Miss Marple left Phillimore's house, she knew that the final act of this long and tragic tale had played out. The village of St. Mary's would never be the same. But with the killer finally exposed, the dark shadow that had loomed over the town would begin to fade. And as always, Miss Marple would quietly fade back into the background, knowing that another mystery had been solved, another truth had been uncovered. The morning after Miss Marple's confrontation with Douglas Phillimore, St. Mary's was eerily quiet. The usual bustle of the village had slowed, the morning fog still clinging to the edges of the narrow lanes, as if the town itself was holding its breath. Miss Marple had done what she did best, unraveled the complex threads of a tragedy, exposed the truth hidden in shadows, and brought the guilty to justice. But now there was only the final, inevitable step, the reveal. The village square, which usually thrived with life, was nearly deserted. Miss Marple stood at the window of her small cottage, looking out over the empty streets. The fog had cleared, and sunlight streamed across the village, casting long shadows across the cobblestones. It was a peaceful scene, but Miss Marple knew that peace often held the quietest dangers. The storm was over now, but the damage had been done. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She turned, her eyes sharp as she moved to answer it. It was time to tie up the final loose ends, and the man who stood on the other side of the door would be the one to take the final step toward the truth. "Good morning, Miss Marple," said Officer Crawley, the village constable. He was a young man, earnest but often overwhelmed by the complexities of real crime. "I trust I'm not disturbing you?" "Not at all, Officer Crawley," Miss Marple replied with a smile. Come in, please. I believe you and I have much to discuss. Crawley stepped inside, his brow furrowed with concern. He had always been respectful of Miss Marple, even if he hadn't fully understood the depth of her insight. Now, however, there was a nervous edge to his demeanor, as though he were expecting a storm to break. Miss Marple had made no secret of the fact that she had her suspicions about the case, and the time had come to see if those suspicions were truly valid. I've been thinking about the case, Crawley began, his voice hesitant. And it seems to me that we've missed something. I don't know what it is, but I feel like something's not right. Could you help me see what I'm overlooking? Miss Marple nodded, gesturing to the chair beside the window. Of course, Officer Crawley. Let us take a seat, and I will tell you what I've found. They both sat down, and Miss Marple took a deep breath before speaking, her voice calm but resolute. The truth is always simple in its essence, Officer Crawley, she began. It is just a matter of uncovering the layers of deception that hide it. What we're dealing with is a tragedy, yes, but also a carefully constructed lie. And the lie is what has kept the truth hidden from the village. Crawley listened intently, his eyes narrowing as Miss Marple continued. The murder of Miss Parsons was no random act, Miss Marple continued. It was a calculated decision by someone who felt their secrets were at risk of being exposed. The killer was someone with much to lose, someone who thought they could control the situation, keep their actions hidden, and walk away unscathed. Who was it? Crawley asked, his voice tight with anticipation. Douglas Phillimore, Miss Marple said, her voice steady. He is the one who killed Miss Parsons. Crawley's face went pale and he shifted uneasily in his seat. But he seemed so calm throughout the investigation. He didn't seem guilty at all. Exactly, Miss Marple replied. He never seemed rattled, did he? That's what made him stand out. Everyone else in the village was upset, shaken, trying to make sense of it all. But Phillimore remained aloof, detached. It wasn't that he didn't care. It was that he already knew the outcome. He had planned it. But how could you be so sure? Crawley asked, his voice full of disbelief. What makes you so certain it was him? Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes focused. I know because of one simple thing, the locked door. The locked door? Crawley repeated, confused. But that was just a mistake. The key was left inside, and Miss Parsons must have tried to escape. Miss Marple shook her head gently. It wasn't a mistake, officer. The locked door was part of the plan. The killer didn't lock it by accident. He locked it from the inside, knowing Miss Parsons would be trapped. And then he waited, knowing she would be unable to escape. Crawley's eyes widened as the truth began to sink in. But why? Why Miss Parsons? What could she have known that made Phillimore so desperate? She knew everything, Miss Marple replied, her voice softening. She knew about the affair between Mrs. Bertram and Phillimore. She had been quietly observing the villagers, picking up on the hidden tensions. When she realized what was happening, she threatened to expose it all. And Phillimore! He couldn't let that happen, Crawley said, his voice low with realization. Exactly, Miss Marple said. He knew that. Once Miss Parsons spoke out, his secret would be out, and his reputation, everything he had worked for, would be destroyed. So he made sure she couldn't tell anyone. He locked her in the study and waited for her to panic, to try and escape. But in the end, it wasn't the door that killed her. It was his desperation. He killed her because she threatened everything he had. Crawley was silent for a moment, processing the enormity of what Miss Marple had just laid out. But how did you figure it out, Miss Marple? It wasn't just the door, Miss Marple said, her voice quiet but resolute. It was the note. The note? Crawley repeated, confused. What note? The note found in Mrs. Bertram's study, Miss Marple explained. The one that was hidden in the drawer. The one that read, I know what you did. You'll pay for it. That note was meant for Mrs. Bertram, but Phillimore didn't count on Miss Parsons finding it. And when she did, she must have known that the walls were closing in on him. That was when he decided to act. Crawley's jaw dropped as he realized the significance of the note. So, Phillimore was threatening Mrs. Bertram, and Miss Parsons found out about it? Exactly, Miss Marple replied. And in the end, it was that final threat that led to Miss Parsons's death. Phillimore tried to control the situation, but his fear of exposure led him to murder. Crawley stood up abruptly, his mind racing with the implications of what Miss Marple had revealed. We need to arrest him, Miss Marple. I can't believe I didn't see it before. But now, with all the pieces in place, it's clear. Phillimore's guilty. Yes, Miss Marple said, rising to her feet. But it isn't just about arresting him. It's about understanding the why. The tragedy here isn't just that Miss Parsons was killed. It's that someone allowed their fear to destroy everything they had. Phillimore's guilt is not just in the murder. It's in the fact that he chose his secrets over everything else. Crawley nodded, his face grim with the weight of the realization. I'll go to the station. I'll take care of it. As he turned to leave, Miss Marple watched him with a soft, knowing smile. I'm sure you will, Officer Crawley. But remember this. Justice is only part of the equation. The true cost of guilt is always much higher than we expect. Crawley gave her a final, grateful nod before stepping out the door. Miss Marple watched him go, feeling the quiet satisfaction that came with the resolution of another case. And, as the village of St. Mary's slowly began to heal, Miss Marple knew that the quiet rhythm of life would resume. The secrets were out, the truth had been exposed, and the village would find its peace once more. But Miss Marple also knew that somewhere in the depths of human nature, there would always be another mystery to solve, another truth to uncover. And she would be ready, as always, to bring it into the light. The days that followed Phillimore's arrest were filled with a strange quietude. St. Mary's, though small and secluded, had always carried a calm undercurrent, its quiet lanes and cobbled streets often offering a sanctuary from the outside world. Yet now, in the wake of the murder and the subsequent revelations, there was a heaviness in the air, a palpable awareness that things had irrevocably changed. Miss Marple sat at her usual place by the window in her cozy cottage, the familiar sights of the village stretching out before her. The soft rustling of leaves, the distant murmur of voices from the market square, it all seemed so normal. But Miss Marple knew better than most that appearances could be deceiving. Beneath the surface of even the most serene villages there were always untold stories, and sometimes those stories revealed the darkest of truths. As she sat in the late afternoon light, Miss Marple's thoughts turned back to the case. The pieces had all fallen into place, each thread of suspicion woven together with quiet precision. She had suspected Douglas Phillimore from the start, but the path to the truth had been longer than she had anticipated. The locked door, the hidden note, the strained relationships, it had all pointed to Phillimore. But it had taken the careful unraveling of the details to expose the man for what he truly was. Miss Marple had always known that the hardest part of any case was not solving the mystery, but understanding the consequences of its resolution. For the people involved, those whose lives were changed forever by the events, they would never be the same again. Her reverie was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Miss Marple rose gracefully from her chair, smoothing her dress as she approached. When she opened the door, she was greeted by the familiar face of Officer Crawley. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," he said, his voice a little quieter than usual. "May I come in?" "Of course, Officer Crawley," Miss Marple replied, stepping aside to let him in. "Please make yourself comfortable." Crawley entered the cottage, his usual posture of nervous energy replaced by a subdued calmness. He had been a dedicated, albeit overwhelmed, constable during the investigation, and Miss Marple knew that the burden of the case had weighed heavily on him. But now, with Phillimore in custody, there was a sense of closure, at least for the village, if not for the man himself. "I wanted to come by and thank you," Crawley said, settling into the armchair opposite Miss Marple. "I don't think I could have solved this case without your help. Your insight, your observations, it all came together in the end." Miss Marple smiled gently, but there was a sadness in her eyes. "I simply helped connect the dots, officer. It was you who took the final steps, who made sure that justice was served. But I do understand how heavy it all feels. A case like this, so tangled in secrets and lies, it's hard not to wonder what the cost of truth really is. Crawley shifted in his chair, his gaze dropping to the floor for a moment. I keep thinking about it, Miss Marple, about the people left behind. Miss Parsons. She didn't deserve to die. And now, with Phillimore in custody, I keep wondering if there's more to this than just a crime of fear and desperation. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her eyes thoughtful. What do you mean, officer? Crawley looked up, his expression pained. I mean, there's always more to a person's story, isn't there? Phillimore, yes, he's guilty, but he wasn't always like this, was he? There must have been something that led him to this point. He was a young, promising solicitor once, wasn't he? And Mrs. Bertram, she must have been just as lost in all of this. She was a victim too, in her own way. Miss Marple nodded slowly. That's true, officer. Mrs. Bertram was trapped in her own set of circumstances. She allowed herself to be drawn into Phillimore's world, believing in promises he could never keep. But as I've often said, the truth is seldom as simple as it seems, and sometimes even the most tragic figures must face the consequences of their choices. There was a long pause as both of them considered the weight of those words. The village, for all its apparent tranquility, had been shaken to its core. The murder of Miss Parsons was not just a crime. It was a catalyst for the darker truths that had lingered beneath the surface for so long. And now, as Phillimore sat behind bars and the villagers began to return to their routines, the question remained, what had they learned from all of this? The following day, Miss Marple attended the small service held for Miss Parsons in the Mi'oi village church. It was a simple affair as the villagers gathered quietly to honor the woman they had lost. Despite the tragedy, there was an air of healing, of a community coming together to mourn the death of one of its own. Miss Marple sat at the back of the church, her eyes resting on the casket, draped in flowers. She watched as the villagers filed in, their faces somber but steady. Each one of them carried their own burdens, their own secrets, and Miss Marple knew that this tragedy would change them all in ways they might not yet understand. As the service came to a close and the villagers filed out, Miss Marple remained seated, her gaze lingering on the altar. It was only then that she felt a tap on her shoulder. Turning, she saw Dr. Parsons standing beside her, his expression filled with a mixture of guilt and resignation. Miss Marple, he said quietly, I wanted to thank you for your help in this terrible matter. I don't know how it could have been resolved without you. Miss Marple looked at him for a moment, her eyes gentle. Dr. Parsons, I understand your grief. But you must know that this loss, though tragic, was not just about Miss Parsons. It was about the choices that all of us make, and the consequences that follow. Dr. Parsons looked down, his face darkened with regret. I failed her, Miss Marple. I failed her as a husband and as a man. I should have seen the signs, should have known what was happening, but I couldn't bring myself to face the truth. Miss Marple placed a hand on his arm, her voice soft. We all fail, Dr. Parsons. It's part of being human, but it is how we choose to move forward after we've failed that defines us. Dr. Parsons nodded slowly, his eyes distant as he processed her words. Then, after a moment, he looked back at her. I think I understand. I must live with this, but I will try to do better. For myself, and for her memory. Miss Marple gave him a small smile, her eyes filled with understanding. That's all anyone can do, Dr. Parsons. As Miss Marple walked away from the church, the village square before her seemed different. The faces of the villagers were less burdened, the weight of suspicion slowly lifting. But Miss Marple knew that the truth once uncovered was not always so easy to bear. For some, the revelation would bring clarity. For others, it would bring regret. The case was over, but the village would never be the same, and neither would the people who had lived through it. Miss Marple, as always, would fade into the background, leaving behind only the memory of her quiet observations, her patient reasoning, and her unwavering pursuit of the truth. For now, the village was at peace. But as Miss Marple knew all too well, the shadows always return. The next mystery, The next truth to be uncovered was never far away, and when it came, she would be ready. The morning sun had fully risen over St. Mary's, casting a soft golden hue across the village. The village square was quiet, as it always was in the early hours, but the air felt different today. The tragedy had settled, and yet there was a sense of change. The people of the village, while still shaken by Miss Parsons' death, seemed to be moving on, each in their own way carrying the weight of the past few weeks like a silent burden. Miss Marple, however, knew that the process of moving on wasn't so simple. The quiet of St. Mary's had been disrupted, and though time would dull the edges of the tragedy, there was a ripple in the village's fabric that would never quite settle back into place. She sat at her small writing desk in the corner of her cottage, her hands folded thoughtfully before her. There had been no further developments in the case, no other secrets to uncover. Phillimore was in custody, and the villagers had begun to resume their routines. The garden party, the murder, and the aftermath were all fading into the background, as if the events had never truly occurred. But Miss Marple knew better than to believe in easy endings. The case may have been solved, but she still felt that something was left unsaid, a lingering question that had yet to be answered. There was more to it, and it wasn't just about the murder. It was about the people, the ones who were left behind, and the truths they had yet to face. Just as she was about to reflect further, a soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Miss Marple rose from her chair, smoothing her dress as she made her way to the door. She opened it to find none other than Mrs. Bertram standing on the doorstep, her face drawn and tired, but still maintaining her usual air of dignity. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Bertram said softly, her voice hesitant. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all, Mrs. Bertram," Miss Marple replied, her tone warm but tinged with a note of concern. "Please come in." Mrs. Bertram stepped inside, her movements slow as though the weight of the world were pressing down on her. She had aged in the last few weeks, and the faint tremor in her hands suggested that the events surrounding Miss Parsons' death were still weighing heavily on her. Despite the fact that Phillimore had confessed, Mrs. Bertram seemed unable to escape the shadows of her past. Miss Marple gestured for her to sit. "I trust you've been well, despite the circumstances?" Mrs. Bertram gave a small, weary smile. "Well enough, Miss Marple, but that's not why I've come today. I've been thinking a great deal about the events of the last few weeks, and I feel I owe you an explanation. One last thing that needs to be said, before we all move on." Miss Marple remained silent, her eyes studying the woman before her. She had long suspected that there was more to Mrs. Bertram's story, that there was a layer of guilt and confusion that the widow hadn't yet fully faced. "Please," Miss Marple said gently. "Speak freely. I'm listening." Mrs. Bertram took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly together in her lap. "I've never been one to talk about my past, Miss Marple," she began, her voice low and filled with regret. But now, I feel I must. Phillimore's actions, his cruelty, it was all because of me. I was the one who led him to this, and I have to live with that." Miss Marple remained still, her gaze never leaving the widow. "Go on, Mrs. Bertram. Tell me what's on your mind." Mrs. Bertram hesitated for a long moment, her eyes looking distant, as though she were reliving the events in her mind. "It wasn't just an affair, you see. It wasn't just a fleeting indiscretion. I loved him. I loved Douglas Phillimore in a way I hadn't loved my husband in years. When I was with him, I felt alive. I felt seen. I was lonely, Miss Marple. Lonely in a way I hadn't been in years. My husband had been ill for so long, and I had no one to talk to, no one to lean on. Phillimore offered me that, and I allowed myself to fall into it." Miss Marple's eyes softened with understanding. Loneliness can drive a person to do things they might not otherwise consider. It's a powerful thing, Mrs. Bertram. Mrs. Bertram nodded slowly, her eyes downcast. "But that's not what I'm ashamed of. What I regret is that I didn't see what it was doing to him. To Douglas. He was always so ambitious, so eager to climb higher in the world. But he thought he could control everything, control me, control the situation. When he realized that Miss Parsons was getting too close, that she might expose everything, He snapped. I never thought it would come to this. I never thought he'd kill her. Do you believe he did it for you? Miss Marple asked quietly, her voice probing but not accusatory. Mrs. Bertram's eyes filled with tears, but she did not cry. Instead, she nodded slowly, her face weary. Yes. I think he did it for me. For us, in a twisted way. He didn't want to lose me, not after everything we'd shared. And he thought that if he got rid of Miss Parsons, everything would go back to normal. He thought he could bury the past and move forward. And you, Mrs. Bertram? Miss Marple asked gently. Do you still love him? The question seemed to catch Mrs. Bertram off guard. She looked up at Miss Marple, her eyes filled with something like sorrow and resignation. I don't know, Miss Marple. I don't know what love is anymore. I've spent my whole life in a web of lies and regrets, and now it feels as though I've lost the ability to truly feel anything. I loved him, yes, but I also feel pity for him now. For what he's become. What we've all become. Miss Marple gave a quiet sigh, her heart heavy with empathy. You have carried a great burden, Mrs. Bertram. But it's never too late to start anew. Even now you have the chance to seek redemption, to live a life free from the shadows of the past. Mrs. Bertram looked at Miss Marple, and for the first time in weeks, there was a glimmer of something in her eyes, perhaps a hint of hope, or at least a willingness to confront the truth. I know, Mrs. Bertram said softly. I just don't know where to begin. By telling the truth, Miss Marple replied, her voice firm but kind. You've already taken the first step by facing it. The rest will come in time. Later that afternoon, after Mrs. Bertram had left, Miss Marple sat quietly at her desk, reflecting on the conversation. The case, though solved, had unearthed much more than just a murder. It had exposed the deep scars of the human heart, secrets, regrets, and the choices that led people down dark paths. And yet Miss Marple knew that this was what made people human. Their flaws, their struggles, their capacity for both great love and terrible mistakes. The truth was always more complicated than it seemed, but it was the truth nonetheless. As the day faded into evening, Miss Marple looked out at the village one last time, her heart full of quiet satisfaction. The village of St. Mary's was still the same, and yet it was forever changed, and Miss Marple, as always, would remain, a silent observer of the world around her, waiting, watching, and knowing that, someday soon, another mystery would beckon her once more. The days after Mrs. Bertram's visit had passed in a gentle blur for Miss Marple. The mystery that had gripped the village for weeks was finally resolved, and the immediate weight of it had been lifted. But the threads of the case were still, woven deeply into her thoughts, tangled with the lives of the people she had come to know so well. There was something about the way each of them had reacted, some with deflection, others with complete denial, that had stayed with her, gnawing at her in a way she couldn't quite place. The village was slowly returning to its usual rhythm, but the undercurrents of unease remained. The faces Miss Marple saw in the market square seemed a little more guarded, a little more aware of the secrets they had kept, and perhaps still kept. Yet there was also a subtle relief, as if the air had been cleared, even if only temporarily. One afternoon, as Miss Marple walked through the quiet lanes of St. Mary's, she noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The streets were a little quieter, the usual hum of activity replaced with a strange stillness. It was as if everyone in the village, consciously or not, was waiting for something. She couldn't shake the feeling that the storm had not quite passed. As she neared the familiar stone bench in the small park, she saw a figure sitting there, Dr. Gerald Parsons. He was alone, his back slightly hunched, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He hadn't noticed Miss Marple's approach, and she quietly took a seat beside him, not wanting to disturb his thoughts. "Good afternoon, Doctor," she said softly, her voice breaking the stillness. Dr. Parsons looked up, startled, but when he saw who it was, he gave her a small, tired smile. "Ah, Miss Marple, I didn't expect to see anyone out here at this hour. I suppose I've been lost in my thoughts." Miss Marple nodded, observing him closely. His features were etched with exhaustion, his usual self-assuredness replaced by a quiet weariness that made him appear far older than his years. He had always been a man of composure, but now he seemed to be unraveling, his mind preoccupied with something Miss Marple couldn't quite decipher. "I trust you're finding some peace after everything," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle. Dr. Parsons hesitated, his gaze drifting to the distant horizon. "I don't know, Miss Marple. I thought that when Phillimore was caught, the weight would lift, that things would return to normal. But it hasn't. It's like the village has changed, and so have I. I can't stop thinking about what happened, and what I could have done differently." Miss Marple studied him carefully, noticing the faint tremor in his hands as they rested on his lap. His grief, she could see, wasn't just for Miss Parsons. It was for himself, for the life he had led and the choices he had made. He had been living a lie for so long, maintaining the facade of a perfect marriage, all while harboring secrets that had inevitably come to light. "Doctor," Miss Marple said after a moment, her voice thoughtful, "sometimes the truth is not about the actions we take, but the choices we make in response to those actions. It's easy to become trapped in regret, to wish we could undo the past. But the only thing we can change is how we move forward." He turned to look at her then, his eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and confusion. "I don't know how to move forward, Miss Marple. My wife, my late wife, wasn't the woman I thought she was. She had her own secrets, just as I had mine. But how do we reconcile that? How do I reconcile the man I was with, the man I am now?" Miss Marple took a deep breath, her gaze steady. "That, doctor, is the hardest part. Reconciliation. You may not find the peace you seek in the way you expect, but peace will come when you stop running from the truth. The truth about yourself, about your choices, and about the people you've loved." Dr. Parsons looked down again, his jaw tightening as he processed her words. There was a long pause before he spoke again, his voice almost a whisper. "I don't know if I can face that truth, Miss Marple. I fear it will destroy me." "Only if you let it," she said gently. "Facing the truth doesn't mean destroying what is left. It means understanding it and finding a way to live with it." For a long moment, the two sat in silence, each contemplating the weight of their conversation. Miss Marple knew that Dr. Parsons was not yet ready to accept the full measure of what he had lost, nor the part he had played in it, but she also knew that sometimes simply speaking the truth was enough to set the process in motion. The sound of footsteps interrupted their quiet exchange, and Miss Marple looked up to see Mrs. Bertram walking toward them, her posture stiff but her face devoid of the usual mask of composure. She looked tired, her steps slow and deliberate, as though she, too, were carrying a heavy burden. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," Mrs. Bertram said, her voice soft, but her eyes betraying a depth of emotion she had not shown before. She paused as she reached the bench, casting a wary glance at Dr. Parsons before she took a seat beside him. "Doctor, I trust you are well?" Dr. Parsons nodded, though his expression remained distant. "I'm managing, Mrs. Bertram. And you? How are you?" "Holding up?" Mrs. Bertram didn't respond immediately. She simply stared ahead, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Miss Marple watched her carefully, sensing that there was something Mrs. Bertram wanted to say, but wasn't sure how to begin. "You know, Miss Marple," Mrs. Bertram said, finally breaking the silence, "I've spent my life pretending that everything was fine, that I was in control of my circumstances, but now I see that pretending doesn't work. The truth always finds its way to the surface." Miss Marple nodded gently. "It does, Mrs. Bertram. The truth always comes out, in the end." Mrs. Bertram sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "I know. And I've been thinking about what you said to me, about facing the truth. I don't know if I'm ready for it, but I know I have to be. I can't keep hiding from what I've done or from what I've allowed to happen." Dr. Parsons shifted uncomfortably beside her. "We all have our regrets, Mrs. Bertram. We've all made mistakes. But we have to find a way to live with them." "I know," Mrs. Bertram whispered. "But it's not just the mistakes, is it? It's the things we've never said, the things we've kept hidden, thinking they'd never come to light." Miss Marple glanced from Mrs. Bertram to Dr. Parsons, sensing that the two were finally starting to confront the truths they had been avoiding for so long. "Sometimes," she said softly, "the most painful truths are the ones we've been hiding from ourselves, but they can also be the ones that set us free." There was a long pause, and then Mrs. Bertram stood up, her expression resolute. "I need to go," she said quietly. "I have to face what I've done. I need to speak to my son, and to the people I've hurt." Dr. Parsons watched her, his face etched with quiet understanding. "I understand, Mrs. Bertram. I think we both do." As Mrs. Bertram walked away, Miss Marple remained seated, her gaze following her until she disappeared from view. She knew the road ahead for both of them would be difficult, perhaps even painful. But for the first time in a long while, both Mrs. Bertram and Dr. Parsons seemed to be taking the first steps toward healing. And that, Miss Marple thought, was the most anyone could hope for. The village of St. Mary's was always at its most peaceful in the late afternoons. As the sun dipped behind the hills, casting long shadows over the cobblestone streets, there was a stillness in the air, one that seemed to belong only to this place. Miss Marple often found solace in that stillness, in the simple moments that followed the storm. But as she walked through the village on that particular afternoon, she felt an unfamiliar weight in the air, something that seemed to linger just beyond her reach. The case was over. The truth had been revealed. Douglas Phillimore was behind bars, and the village, although shaken, was beginning to move on. Yet Miss Marple knew that the aftermath of such a revelation was never as clean-cut as it appeared. People were never truly free of their pasts. They carried their secrets with them, whether they acknowledged them or not. And though Phillimore had confessed, the emotional and psychological scars left by his actions would not simply vanish. Her steps were slow as she made her way down the village lane, passing the familiar houses and shops. She had not expected the calm to settle so quickly, but it had, almost as if the village had inhaled deeply, then exhaled with a quiet, collective relief. The once tense atmosphere had faded, but there was a lingering sense of change, of quiet reckoning. Miss Marple was approaching the small green at the center of the village when she noticed a familiar figure sitting alone on the bench, his back slightly hunched as he stared into the distance. It was Dr. Gerald Parsons, looking more weary than ever. Miss Marple had noticed him in the village square several times over the past few days, walking alone with a distant look in his eyes, his movements slower than they had been before. She could sense that he was still carrying the weight of everything that had happened, despite the resolution of the case. She approached him quietly, knowing that he would not be startled by her presence. Dr. Parsons had always been a man of measured reactions, but there was a vulnerability in his demeanor now that Miss Marple had not seen before. He looked up as she neared, offering her a small, tired smile. "Miss Marple?" he greeted her, his voice gentle but heavy with fatigue. "I was wondering if you might come by." Miss Marple smiled in return and sat down beside him. "I didn't think you'd be out here today, Dr. Parsons. It's been a difficult few weeks, hasn't it?" He nodded slowly, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. "I can't say that I've found peace yet, Miss Marple. The case may be resolved, but I feel like I'm still caught in the middle of it all. It's as if I'm walking through the aftermath, unsure of where I stand." Miss Marple glanced at him, her eyes soft with understanding. "The hardest part, I believe, is not facing the consequences of your actions, but the consequences of your silence. You've been carrying a heavy burden, Dr. Parsons, and I know it's not easy to come to terms with it." He sighed, a deep, almost defeated sound. "I never realized how much I had been hiding from myself, from everyone. The affair, my neglect of Miss Parsons, the lies I told myself, they've all come back to haunt me. I thought I could bury them, but they found their way to the surface, and now I don't know how to live with it." Miss Marple regarded him for a long moment before speaking. "It's not about burying the past, Doctor. It's about facing it and making the decision to change. You cannot change what's been done, but you can choose how you move forward." Dr. Parsons shook his head. "I don't know how to move forward, Miss Marple. What kind of man am I now? I wasn't there when Miss Parsons needed me the most, and I failed her. I failed myself." "You're not the only one who failed her, Doctor," Miss Marple said softly. "We all have our regrets, but it's never too late to change. The truth may have come too late for Miss Parsons, but it's not too late for you." The doctor remained silent for a moment, staring at the ground. Then he looked up at Miss Marple, his expression more composed than before. "You're right. Of course, it's just hard to accept. I'll never be able to undo what's been done, but perhaps I can try to do better. For myself. For her memory." Miss Marple gave him a small, knowing smile. "That's all anyone can do, Doctor. Parsons, you can't undo the past, but you can learn from it and try to make amends where you can." Dr. Parsons nodded slowly, as if a weight had shifted slightly from his shoulders. "Thank you, Miss Marple. I needed to hear that." As the conversation faded into silence, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on what had transpired. The doctor's guilt, his struggle with the truth, and his eventual acceptance, albeit tentative, of the consequences of his actions. It was a process that she had seen many times before, but that didn't make it any easier to witness. The human heart was a complex thing, and even the most well-intentioned people could become ensnared in webs of their own making. Miss Marple sat quietly beside Dr. Parsons, watching as the sun continued its slow descent, casting the village in warm, golden light. The quiet was comforting, but she knew that beneath this calm, there was still much work to be done. The villagers would carry their scars with them, and some would take longer than others to face the truth. She looked over at Dr. Parsons again, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a sense of resolve, a willingness to take responsibility for his past and move forward. It was not an easy path, but it was a necessary one. As the evening light grew dimmer, Miss Marple stood, her movements slow but deliberate. "I think it's time for me to be on my way, Doctor," she said quietly. "But remember, the truth may be a difficult thing to face, but it is also the only thing that can set us free." Dr. Parsons stood as well, his face thoughtful but more at peace than it had been before. "Thank you, Miss Marple. You've helped me more than you know." With a final nod, Miss Marple turned and walked away, her heart heavy with the understanding that while the case had been solved, the real work of healing and reconciliation had only just begun. Later that evening, Miss Marple sat in her cottage, the warm glow of the fire casting long shadows on the walls. She had spent the afternoon talking to Dr. Parsons, but her mind was still restless. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something left unresolved, something that still lingered in the air, waiting to be addressed. Her thoughts turned to Mrs. Bertram. The widow had left the village for a time, presumably to deal with the aftermath of the affair with Phillimore. But Miss Marple knew that Mrs. Bertram would eventually return. Everyone in St. Mary's would have to face their truths, whether they were ready or not. And as much as Miss Marple wished she could offer a quick solution, she knew that some things took time. There was no easy path to redemption, and the road to peace was often a long one. But as Miss Marple sat there in the quiet of her cottage, she knew that the people of St. Mary's would eventually find their way, even if it meant facing the darkest corners of their hearts. And when the next mystery arose, because she knew it would, Miss Marple would be ready to meet it with the same quiet resolve that had guided her through the many mysteries before. The peaceful serenity of St. Mary's, once shattered by the tragic events surrounding Miss Parsons's murder, had returned. Yet, like the lingering mist that clung to the hills in the early morning, there was a sense of something still unsettled in the village. The case was over. Phillimore was imprisoned, and the villagers were returning to their everyday lives. But the small, subtle shifts that had occurred in the hearts and minds of the people lingered. Change, Miss Marple knew, often followed in the wake of truth, but it didn't always come easily. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when Miss Marple found herself once more in the village square. The streets were quiet, the shops closed for the day, and only a few villagers wandered the lanes. She could feel the calmness in the air, yet something about it seemed fragile. The village had returned to its routine, but for some, those whose lives had been irrevocably altered by the events of the past weeks, that normality was impossible to reclaim. She was about to turn toward her cottage when she spotted someone familiar walking slowly down the street. It was Mrs. Bertram, looking more fragile than Miss Marple had ever seen her. The widow was dressed in black, her hands clasped tightly. In front of her as she walked, her head slightly bowed. There was something about her posture, an air of resignation, that made Miss Marple pause. The woman had changed since the revelation of her affair with Phillimore, and though the truth had been exposed, it was clear that Mrs. Bertram had not yet come to terms with what had been uncovered. Miss Marple waited for her to approach, and when Mrs. Bertram saw her, she stopped, offering a small, tight smile. There was a faint trace of sadness in her eyes, but it was quickly masked by the veneer of composure that had always defined her. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," she said softly. "I wasn't expecting to see you today." "Good afternoon, Mrs. Bertram," Miss Marple replied, her voice warm but perceptive. "I thought I'd catch up with you. How are you, truly?" Mrs. Bertram sighed, her gaze turning toward the distant horizon as if she were searching for answers in the quiet landscape. "I'm managing," she said, her voice tinged with a weariness that was hard to miss. "But it hasn't been easy. There are things I'm still trying to make sense of. Not just Phillimore's actions, but my own. Mistakes." Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her voice remained steady. "We all have our regrets, Mrs. Bertram. But it's not about the things we wish we could undo. It's about the choices we make now, the steps we take toward reconciliation. You can't change the past, but you can decide how to move forward." Mrs. Bertram nodded slowly, her eyes distant. "I've been thinking a lot about that, Miss Marple. I've spent so much of my life pretending to be something I wasn't, trying to control everything, to maintain appearances. But the truth has a way of making itself known. It always finds its way to the surface, no matter how much we try to bury it." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, "the truth does have a way of finding us. And when it does, we must choose how we face it. You've taken the first step, Mrs. Bertram, by acknowledging the reality of what happened. It's never easy to confront the past, but it's the only way to find peace." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet of the village seemed to stretch out around them, and Miss Marple could feel the weight of Mrs. Bertram's internal struggle. The widow had spent years hiding from the truth, and now that it had come to light, she was grappling with the consequences of her choices. But Miss Marple knew that the journey to healing wasn't instantaneous. It was a gradual process that required courage and self-reflection. "I've decided to leave, Miss Marple," Mrs. Bertram said, her voice barely above a whisper. Miss Marple looked at her, surprised. "Leave?" "Yes," Mrs. Bertram replied, her hands tightening in front of her. "I've spoken to my son. He's agreed to take me in, away from the village. I think it's time for me to step away from all of this, to try to find some peace, away from the reminders of what I've done and what I've allowed to happen." Miss Marple studied her for a moment, her eyes filled with quiet understanding. "Leaving may bring you some distance, Mrs. Bertram, but it will not free you from the past. You can't outrun it, but you can choose to face it, and by doing so, you will find the peace you seek." "I know," Mrs. Bertram whispered, her voice trembling, "but it feels like the only way to move on. Maybe in time, I'll be able to come back to the village. But for now, I need to find a place where I can sort through all of this." Miss Marple nodded, her expression soft. "I understand. Sometimes a change of scenery is what we need to gain perspective. But remember, Mrs. Bertram, peace comes from within. It's something we have to make for ourselves." Mrs. Bertram's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she nodded. "I'll try, Miss Marple. I really will." As they stood there, the quiet of the village settled around them once more. Miss Marple knew that Mrs. Bertram had made the right choice for herself. She needed time and space to reconcile her past, to find the strength to face what had happened and rebuild. Miss Marple could only hope that, in time, the widow would come to terms with the guilt that had plagued her for so long. "Goodbye, Mrs. Bertram," Miss Marple said gently. "I wish you all the best on your journey. Remember, it's never too late to make a change. It's never too late to choose a different path." Mrs. Bertram gave her a faint smile, the sadness still present but softened by a trace of gratitude. "Thank you, Miss Marple. You've been a great help to me, more than you." "No." With one last glance, Mrs. Bertram turned and began to walk down the village lane, her pace steady but thoughtful. Miss Marple watched her for a moment, then turned back to the quiet streets of St. Mary's. The village, like its inhabitants, would never be the same. But time, as always, would heal its wounds. The threads of the past would fade, and the villagers would learn to live with the choices they had made, the secrets they had kept. And when the next mystery arose, Miss Marple would be there, watching quietly from the background, waiting for the next truth to be revealed. For now, St. Mary's was at peace. The storm had passed, and the village had settled back into its rhythm, its quiet heartbeat resuming its familiar pattern. But Miss Marple knew that, like all things, this too would change in time. There would be more secrets, more mysteries to solve, and she would be ready, as always, to uncover the truth.